design, and this is a framework that has come out of a challenge that we got from Birger Sevason and Andreas Vettere to look into how to design an implementation framework for systems-oriented design. I will present what is the first version of our framework. We will have a look at the details a bit later. I think it's okay that we go into some key principles and topics first. So if we look at systems-oriented design, it's a methodology and a design practice that is especially aimed or geared at understanding and working with complex systems, according to Birger. And systems-oriented design, of course, includes design and implementation of interventions that is aimed at creating change. And implementation is a process that has to navigate ambiguity, balance multiple factors, such as time, perspectives, resources, scales, within the current and the future state of the system. So in systemic design, in systemic change, there might not be a definitive state for the end of the implementation. There will always be things that has to be picked up and looked further at, or it could be changes that's necessary. Which means that observing and supporting outcomes is important. And in our framework, we have looked into how to do this. So SODIF, as we call it, provides a framework for the implementation process with defined pathways and key elements to consider along those pathways. So as you navigate, you find key elements to consider, but also the actual pathway in relation to the elements is a part of the consideration. So SODIF is about the journey of designing and iterating on implementation strategies rather than reaching an endpoint as in a linear way. By, for example, implementing a specific design solution. It's about the actual pathways and how they can be used to guide that implementation and then work further on it. So SODIF framework identifies also a set of roles that is needed, or at least what we saw as beneficial to have within this process of implementation. It can be that one person takes on multiple roles, or it can be a whole team that has multiple roles. But we see that someone has to be the person to open doors, cross boundaries. Someone has to be the designers. Someone should be good in facilitation. There might be the need for someone to tell the story, think in systems and systems theory, for example. And there is also someone has to have an idea about resources or management of resources, which of course all of these things impact implementation. We did include a bit into the design process just to give you a sort of a reflection on the thought process for our part. It started actually from working on the creative process framework in systems-oriented design, and then shifting towards looking at implementations. And we tried to see that from multiple perspectives. And we went through theory to look there, and we also had reflections on own experience. We are a team that's experienced with many years of working experience. And we took that further into design, trying very hard to move away from linear approaches, which is something that tends to dominate some of these implementation frameworks. And we looked at it through facilitation, through the roles, at what sort of barriers and limits occur. And we started to move towards a circular pathway sort of approach. And then, inspired by something organic like cells, we started to see these pathways emerge. And then working further on that based on both experience and theory, we started to draw up this framework and describe it. And also these roles emerged because of the pathways and the relations between the elements. So if we end up at the implementation framework itself, the idea is not to go from left to right, but sort of come in and rethink what you have in your proposition. Do you have to clarify ambiguity, for example? Is there an iteration needed? Do you need to adjust something? Is it something that has to be adopted? And then if you want to go into the actions necessary, do you have an idea on what this ought to be, what the intervention is about? How are you going to approach it? what are the resources, the stakeholders involved, what is the time and plan, how is the communication going to take place. And you can see that there might be changes needed, and you might, for example, have to go into reflection and check back with the original proposition, perhaps even back to the creative process, validate something, establish new boundaries for the implementation, or perhaps go for the first implementation and see what happens, support it, develop it, react on things that happens, and feed that back into the framework. So as indicated with this sort of white dot, the facilitation is a key thing here to take the team mentally and sort of process-wise through this framework as you work on complex issues, and use it as a framework to do so. And of course, the different roles have different effects on, or so on facilitation here. So there is no one leader all the way. They can change between who's facilitating what in relation to what's going on within the framework. How am I doing on time, by the way? Because we can go into a bit more details, but
I guess you can just quickly wrap up, Espen.
Sorry, just to wrap up here.
Yeah, just quickly wrap up if you have something to say upon.
Yeah, just as we said, there is not a definitive end state. I think that's sort of a thing to think about here, that implementations just don't end by following a linear path and then you're finished. There is often the need to go through some of these pathways and work on these to succeed with implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Espen. I was just thinking about how different would it be from the double diamond process of reflecting proposition on action and implementation. Probably we could discuss it with Jonathan at the, we are done with the presentation. So yeah, thank you, Espen. And I would like to call Eunji, who would be presenting with value mapping for stakeholders engagement.
Hello, my name is Eunji Park, an executive director at Indeed Innovation. We are a innovation consultancy focused on circularity. We're based in Germany. So today I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction or overview of the project background, and then go into the process of mapping this topic. So this project was commissioned by Adapa Group, which is a European packaging manufacturer based in Austria. And they wanted to co-develop a business case for product traceability through enabling what's called digital product passport. I'm not going to go into this topic, which is really growing topic in this industry, but this was a technology enabler for them to innovate in the packaging business. But to start, they were recognizing the plastic waste, and part of the big plastic waste origin was from packaging, which they are responsible for. And European regulation is focusing on this topic more and more, and the law is coming. And that was initial motivation, but then client instantly thought about maybe not just compliance reasons, but they want to sort of future-proof their innovation. So one of the initial framing of the topic was looking at the plastic waste in a different manner. What if the plastic waste was, or packaging waste was a resource that should be retrieved, and it's a value for the business and everybody in the value chain. So with that, we were looking at packaging as a part of the solution with the client and thinking about what technology can be deployed, as well as what systems do we need to investigate. And that was one part of this mapping exercise. And I mentioned this word briefly before. This was the technology enabler that client was trying to implement, but then what they were missing was this stakeholder perspective, and they were lacking this systematic view of their business. And part of their business concept they started with was creating this digital ecosystem. So this was a big leap for them as a packaging manufacturer. And one of the packagings they make is Haribo. You probably know this gummy bear packaging. and they were merely a supplier or manufacturer of the plastic packaging. However, they knew that to comply to emerging law, as well as really looking at the future of how do we mitigate the waste generated from us, and also still delivering the value of the packaging, which is protecting the product itself. They needed to instantly work with this broad network of the partners, which are, traditionally competitors. Sometimes they don't really look at it in a traditional sense, but in the new circular economy lens, all of a sudden they need these partners to work together to achieve the goal. So to get there, we did 3 things as a main exercise or activities. And also this was very repetitive and iterative exercise that really fed the map, and also sort of like we gained the story out of the mapping. So there was the big loop going in circles throughout the project. And it started with the stakeholder identification, started with the client's network that was existing. So we were looking left and right, their value chain, the suppliers of the packaging materials, to printers, to retailers who's putting these products in the market, and then users, and so on and so forth. And then we also added our secondary research to identify who's in the value chain of the packaging materials. And from then on, we did the qualitative interviews. And there were 4 framing questions that led to structuring the map and designing the map, which was mainly 4 things. What is the main activity or need that triggers the first occasion of a process? Who and what is involved in this activity? And what are the interdependencies and interrelations? Who is doing what, in what order? What is needed? What kind of knowledge or data is needed for this? And also what context purpose is created to coordinate the process and systems. So we started with somewhat very kind of crude flowchart-like things with the players, stakeholders identified from the initial research. And then that sort of got more formulated in the linear fashion of defining the main stages or steps. And then we start layering the activities and more stakeholders, primaries, secondaries, and so on. And then at this point, we involve the stakeholders internally in the beginning with the client team to, 1, confirm the accuracy and see if there's any gaps in our overview. Then later on, we involved external stakeholders. If the business case were to be real, the potential partners in their network was the reviewer, and they gave a lot of feedback for us to get to this point. And at this point, we were looking at what kind of story that we can convey in this map, and then thought about the right design, information hierarchy, and so on, to really tell the story of what could be done in the packaging value chain and what kind of value that can be recreated for all stakeholders involved. So I would just wrap it there.
Thank you, Eunji. I would really like to know more about the digital product passports and how it's evolving and unfolding back in Europe, and what major significance does it play in complexity of packaging industry. Thank you once again. And I'd like to call Sally Traus Mallma, who will be presenting socioecological corridors in Monterey. Yes, Sally, we can see your screen. And you can
I was muted. Sure. Okay, thank you. We want to present this collective project called Tejiendo Montañas, socioecological corridors in Monterey. So we want to explain that this project raises from the challenge in 3 situations. One is the climate crisis, then the loss of biodiversity, and also the fragmentation of habitats caused by human activities. So in this sense, we want to value nature, considering mountains as an opportunity to bring the ecological connectivity, the reintegration of nature with people through the interscalar networks. By doing that, we studied a morphology of ecological corridors to apply the socioecological concept. This approach focuses on how ecosystems help to cope with external conditions through the services they provide and the benefits they provide to communities. The scheme also considers that ecosystems are influenced by boundary conditions, such as climatic trends, public policies related to natural resources, and socioecological environments of the communities.
And we wanted to mention that for looking into opportunities, we didn't only just went to the online data, but we also went on site. Also to doing collective walks with people from the community to getting knowledge and understand the variables of the system and the opportunities for socioecological connectivity between the mountains and the city and the different corridors. And then we also map these down into collective maps that help us to
And speaking about the project, Tejiendo Montañas, the intentions of the project are focused on ensuring the right to nature to the entire population. This process is divided into 3 phases: identify, connect, and renaturalize or rewilding. And in the first phase of identifying, we point out topography, because in Monterrey there is no relation within the city. Then the protected natural areas in order to guarantee the right to nature to the entire population. Then the water network in order to identify these water currents and heal them up. Then the areas that tend to be flooded compared to the urbanization in order to have this look into the areas that tend to be affected during these rains. And this in order to identify these current areas that are affected, but in order there are like this rewilding potential. And in the second phase, with the purpose of connecting, we identify existing green areas, common spaces, schools, and disused land as a possible actors in order to include this in these socio-ecological corridors, and with this educational program that complements these lines with corridors. And in the third phase, we are identifying industry as a potential actor and thinking about public policies in order to, with the industry, to play a more responsible and caring role in the city. And now we are seeing how these socio-ecological corridors are like a drawing, connecting all these important dots that help us with these potential actors. And this is a look in metropolitan scale with all these rivers that are currently in the city. And then this is like a more urban scale with this urban node that we did an implementation case.
So lastly, we looked into like how these spaces could be already with an intervention on the space, and also we were looking into the different ecosystems that are in this area of the metropolitan area of Monterrey. And yeah, so we looked into productive shrublands, pollination gardens, but also flood zones, and how also the ravines can be opened again and be also part of this connectivity. And so this is just like another side view of a public school, and then we can look into this another image of the school that has already this implementation of this socio-ecological equipment. And if you can go on, Sally, with the other different visualizations. So this is like a park. This is a ravine. That is a socio-ecological corridor. And these are just like visualizations on how these interventions could look in the place.
Thank you, Sally and team. Oh, go ahead, Sally.
Oh, sorry. Just to close with the final idea that Tejiendo Montañas wants to raise this integration with people and nature through socioecological interventions, programs, by involving them. So it's important for this in the process, citizen participation. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Sati and team. I would like to call Darwin, who would be speaking about ecotones, tensions, innovation, and systemic changes.
And today I'm going to talk about ecotones. So for this particular talk, I want to get everybody to focus on 3 aspects of this idea. The first one is probably going to be more central according to this idea of ecotone, is that not all pain points are of the same types. So, there are, pain points that are emerged because of misalignments of people's different expectations, different actors' expectations, for example. But the one that I want us to focus on is the contradiction in principles that causes those pain points. So this is the first aspect. The second aspect is that this ecotone is grounded on the philosophy of critical realism, and then that's kind of the foundation of my philosophical approach to design as well. But essentially, what it is, in a very simplified manner, it's taking from kind of like pushing from Kant's transcendental question about how is this possible, how is that possible, very much focused on people's structure of the mind. What critical realists are trying to push for is to include the ecosystem, the world, right? By asking what the world has to be like in order for this and that to be possible. So this is the second aspect, the philosophical foundation. The third one would be taking cue from inspiration from the environmental sciences on ecotones, basically the overlapping of 2 different ecosystems that create this kind of like boundaries called ecotone. And a lot of design, I think, that have taken the ecotone inspiration too. For example, Pendello Julian in architecture talking about how different disciplines come together and create new disciplines, what's called the boundary effects and so forth. But what I am interested in, to tie back to pain points, is to look at what kind of tensions emerge from these ecotones, right? So what about ecotone in surface design? So think about Bhaskara's critical realism that I was mentioning before. We want to include the world, not just the individual. So which means as soon as 2 different actors interact, they create, their space becomes an ecotone because they themselves have the ecosystems, their world that they bring with them, that influence their motivations, their goals, their behaviors, and so on and so forth. And by investigating when there are tensions happen, when there are pain points that either actors are experiencing, the purpose of mapping this ecotone is try to look at how the structure of their world are contributing to those tensions. And when we find out that some of these structures in the ecosystems, for example, it could be rules, regulations, corporate goals, and so forth, directly contribute to the tension that arises, that is a contradiction in principle. Let's see. So this is just an example of the work that I did in the past about like caregivers and their clients' interactions. As you can see, when we look at just their interactions, the experience, whether, providing extra hours or receiving extra hours from the caregivers, it seems like there are some internal human experience that causes some of these tensions, right? But when we zoom out and include the ecosystems, then we realize that, oh, there's specific legal responsibilities that's outlined by the state. And then from the client's perspective, oh, their hours are assessed by the state as well, right? So here we can see how, you know, the structure are directly contributing to their pain points. So the idea here, using Ecotones as a map, and then using the critical realist approach to find the pain points where it's contradiction in principle. We want to move from asking questions like, how do we improve efficiency? How can we help people manage stress? How can we help people manage their finances? Into a more structural and systemic problem. You know, how does this structure define efficiency? You know, why is it defined this way anyway, right? What structural issues that contribute to people's stress? You know, why are people so, you know, paid so poorly in this system? You know, what are the structure that causes that? You know, what Bhaskar called causal mechanisms. But going back to surface design, we can use this framework to say contribute to, you know, the ecosystem mapping, for example, where usually we have horizons in layered horizon, but now we can add kind of what's the foundation for the structural change that could help that. So to sum up, you know, keep thinking about using this ecotone framework to think about what the structure of the world is like, because human behaviors, you know, are advocated by their motivational incentives. And beyond that, there's kind of like organizational rules that influence them. And then there's social structure, there's political economic system, and so forth. So the idea is not just thinking about using this ecotone to think about like whys, but we have to think about whys in a deliberate and stratified manner. So that's me. I'm a bit past time. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Darwin. It's an interesting topic for me as well, thinking about critical realism and how critical realism would provide a transitional space so as to break the institutional logics or the organizational structure, or provide a space where it could be efficient in a way. Thank you once again. I would like to call Jonathan. Jonathan would help us provide his valuable comments, and thus we can start with a dialogue probably amongst us. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand and go ahead.
Thanks, Akash, and thank you all for wonderful presentations. I think, you know, being this Mapping Monday, it illustrates the power of mapping and the way they are, and the breadth of how one can use mapping in all kinds of different areas and trajectories. So I really find those maps, or these cases and maps that you presented very interesting and thought-provoking. So I would like to kind of address the maps specifically with some remarks. So first I'll go with kind of sequential, the way they were presented today. So so for the group working with the SODIF implementation framework, I really think that, so first of all, thank you for this, both well-informed, and I think it's this wonderful combined map of both sequential and circular gigamap at the same time, that somehow tries to illustrate these pathways of navigating complex implementation processes. And I find it extremely interesting, and I love the dynamics of the feedback loops that have been annotated onto the map, trying to capture these mechanisms that goes on in such processes. So, and I think it's great that these kinds of framework emerges from the executive master course at AHU. So it's super nice. I guess my main question regarding this part, and we can maybe turn back to it, is what was the purpose of this framework? Is this a framework that is intended to lay out a conceptual framework of the phenomenon itself, or is it more like a guide for practicing systems-oriented designers of what things they may have to, you know, take into consideration? So kind of how do you imagine this framework being useful? I mean, a part of a learning in a learning environment, in a sense. So that would be my kind of triggering question to you. However, so I don't know if we should open for some comments now, or I should just maybe I should just make some comments in general, then we can go back to some of these questions. So please note that down. So the second presented model was the value mapping stakeholder engagement map. And again, I think this is also kind of illustrating a circular or a sequential, although circular kind of gigamap. And it's very clear and easy to read. So I really think you managed to capture a rather complex phenomenon involving many different factors into a very clear and accessible map, actually. So that I would really thank you for making that information available in such an accessible way. And I perceive this is kind of an illustration of material stocks and flows that goes in and out to the system. And it involves also the main points of interest related to that. So I guess my main question or research is, could you say more about both the trajectories leading out? I see that there's some stocks coming in, and then there's some trajectories leading out. I would like to hear more about that, and you know, what's the scale of those in terms of the graphical emphasis that you put on that. So I think it's also important to figure out what are these things that goes out of this giant loop. And the other thing is maybe more about the lanes of the circularity. What informed your decision to, for instance, put the product data and then logistics and then sales, and those lanes, and some of them are highlighted more than others. So I would also like to hear a bit more about that, maybe in our discussion later on. Then jumping into the monetary metropolitan area process that was presented afterwards, I think it's very powerful to have contextual maps that actually map out a certain context, because again, it makes it very easy to access and to follow, because we are quite known with this kind of type of map to orient ourselves within. And I think the idea of applying the lenses or trying to kind of approach a context with the lenses of socio-ecological pathways or let's say corridors is very powerful and promising. So I think that's very, very nice that you've done it this way. And I think that, but then, I mean, I was looking at those maps as they were depicted on the map, and I was trying to translate some of the things you've written about it. And I think that when you also showed the meso perspectives of some of the ideas you have for interventions and things like that, it really became much more alive and clear. So I think that was very useful to also see some of the more meso, and maybe I mean I would go also into the micro maybe, but combining this macro perspective and the meso perspective, I think makes it much more readable of what you're trying to actually achieve with this mapping. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about whether you have thought about including those meso perspectives into the map somehow and integrating it into one single composition, because then that would strengthen, I think, your map. So how to do these compositions of both macro perspective, corridors, like a bird eye perspective, but then also going into the maybe meso and micro perspective on that same map in a sense. So that's kind of my challenge to you a bit. Would like to hear your thoughts about that. And when it comes to the last map, I was really I think it was really interesting to see to approach mapping from this Econote perspective. I find it very, I mean, I define this as relational mapping somehow. So these are two ecosystems that are relating to one another or overlapping one another. And it's in this relational dialogic or interactions that I find this map very interesting to approach. But I think that so this, I mean, how, and one thing that I find particularly interesting in this map is that it combines both the emotional and the functional aspects involved. So you have like the functional and the emotional aspect. And I was curious to hear more about how should one approach mapping these emotions involved in each of those two, let's say, ecosystems that somehow needs to negotiate or that kind of suddenly find themselves overlapping each other. So I'm particularly interested in this emotional aspect because I think we have a tendency as systemic designers to overload the functional part, the technocratic part into those equations. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that, and also maybe a bit about the speculations regarding the emergent behaviors that we were also touching upon, with the different horizons that may be unpacked in this intermediate space between those two ecosystems. So I guess that's kind of some both remarks and some questions to you that to spark off the conversation maybe. So I don't know if any of you has some comments or some sharing of thoughts that you would like to respond to some of my questions or provocations. Please raise your hand if you have any inputs or if you can help me to learn more.
Well, I can start. Thank you for the comment, Jonathan. I'm going to start with your first question. How, I think maybe paraphrasing, I heard that how is it being used and how did we envision being used? It was for visioning, I would say in one word. So we wanted to reimagine the current linear plastic packaging value chain. And this was in a way, paradigm shift for the manufacturers like them. So it was very critical to establish that from the get-go. So from linear supply chain thinking to circular value chain or value network thinking was very important. So if you guys recall the map progression, it was very linear format, and this was very important for us to accurately represent the current status quo. But then soon we realized that wasn't really that useful for our client and what they wanted to do within the value chain. It was more for what it could be. So future visioning was the goal. Therefore, we made a map sort of loop and connect, and that was very important aspect to designing it later on. Second question, I think second, third, I think you kind of mentioned about data representation and what was the decision making of different layers or different components. And this was again with the idea of what this map is functioned for the client in their storytelling, their visioning within their organization, as well as with the external partners. The map has to serve very clear view on what they can achieve together. So we quickly understood the priorities, which actors should be highlighted and what layer. For example, logistics, we learned that initially in the map, it was one of the value chain component in the block, but then we put it out in the background because many stakeholders that we interviewed say that's completely different industry. They have their own thing going on and so on. So I think this really led to creating this final version.
Thank you. I think that's a good remark. So to make the stakeholders able to see themselves as part of the map is some of those things who guides our decisions of how to lay out different kinds of information. It's a very good answer. Any other comments or anybody wants to respond to my maybe interpretations? Yes, Espen.
Yes, I could just revert back to you asking who is our framework designed for and who is going to use it. And I'll include also a question that Peter had in the chat. Have you tested this? And say something about that. So first of all, we designed SODIF for those who, or for SODIF, sorry, system-oriented designers and those who are part of system-oriented design projects as a framework for reflection and navigation in terms of working with interventions. So you have sort of an idea that you have to have some knowledge about systems-oriented design or be part of it at least with someone who has. In terms of usage, I have tested it in a real project with a real client as a way to go but from SIP analysis to impact and threshold analysis for planning and designing interventions, to make them reflect on what we should include as criteria, but who is also going to take charge or be responsible for the different parts that we are discussing within this context and what we are going to do, and also relate that to time and effort. I can't say it's too much about the details, unfortunately. That would be great, but that was sort of the first attempt to use it, and then we use it as a reflective framework, more than anything quite practical. We just talked a lot about the different aspects and then used that discussion to formulate the impact and threshold analysis and the further work. So that's sort of the first practical test from my part, and I think Ingrid, you could say something about it from the Dolga side.
Yes, I think it's worth pointing out that the SODIF team all came at it from a very practical. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Came at it from a very practical angle. We're all practitioners, and we are looking for tools to use in our practical work. As architects and designers, if we are not implementing ourselves, we are advising people in implementation processes. And so this is a very, it's a very useful summary to introduce certain concepts into an otherwise often extremely linear progression of things. So this is the way that we have used it in Dolga as well, where I'm developing, let's say, a challenge to the construction industry, which is like the mother of all linear processes, the construction of a building with all its risks and all its costs. So that just to be able in a structured and theoretically well-argued way to introduce loops into those processes have been very useful, I think, in a lot of our day-to-day practical work.
Thank you. I really think that's very interesting, and but still, I think you are maintaining some kind of sequential core here. Proposition, action, implementation. Why do you choose to still keep those separated from one another? It's just to follow up your question. Is that to kind of
we cannot change the direction of time, Jonathan?
Yeah. No, I know.
And the sequence of action, the sequence of human action. And so I think while we were discussing this, obviously this was done in the question of in the context of our master's course, when we were doing it, the main element that was new to us was really the introduction of the proposition. Not as a plan of action, but as a possibility that you kept coming back to, so that instead of closing down opportunities, you are, with every iteration, keeping them open. So that, and I think you still need to somehow keep those chickens separated in order to, for other people to follow the discussion.
Yeah, and also the one earlier version had the arrows pointing both ways, so you could actually come from implementation and go through the framework to make a proposition. So we had discussions about this because of what you're bringing up, the sort of linearity of those three, proposition, action, and implementation. So that's sort of, that arrow alone sort of is something that we have to look further into, perhaps.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll make some remark to answer your question, Jonathan. Thank you so much. So the easier, there are two aspects that you asked. One is about the emergent behavior, and then secondly is about the emotional aspect. They're related, but I can start with the emergent behavior first. So from the work, from my past work, when we are looking at the interactions, when we kind of like met the two ecosystems together. So what tends to happen, at least I could cite like, at least two different projects that I start to observe when I think about it this way, is that precisely because people, human beings, are not constrained by their institutional functions. Their human nature always bleeds out, right? Like a nurse is not just a nurse, a caregiver is not just caregivers. There are aspects of care, compassion, and so forth that are not exactly aligned to their structural functions. And because of that, emergent behavior happen in that they try to hack or work around their institutional functions in order to address the needs of their service recipients, for example. And what's really interesting is in the case of caregivers and nurses is that even though they don't network together, even if these caregivers or nurses are in the opposite sides of the country, when they encounter the same problem, because human nature, I don't want to go too deeply about this, we cannot define it, that there's like a shared disposition of all of us, the emergent behavior are very similar. And that's why in the map, it's very useful to take that into part of the evolution mapping, for example. Could this be a new capabilities? Because people across the world, do this, it's almost kind of like synchronicity without having to communicate with each other, right? So that part is really interesting. So thank you for catching that. The second really related part is the emotional aspect. The emotion is hugely important to be mapped in the ecotones, precisely because, as I mentioned, that humans are not just defined by their institutional functions. My job, like the work that I do at an organization, is defined by my job description, right? But obviously we are all more than kind of like just what we do from 9 to 5. In critical realist theory, and I try to adapt this to the ecosystem, is that there are three domains of reality. It's a very stratified analysis of what reality is. So there's a domain of the empirical, the actual, and the real. So in the ecotone, the emotional aspect is what kind of like drives what happened on the empirical level. So that needs to be explicitly mentioned and explain kind of like what are in the domain of the real, what are the causal mechanisms that causes those emotional aspects to emerge. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I wonder if we have a few. Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. Yeah. And important as well. I really like that you added that aspect into the mapping template. So it's very interesting. I wonder if we have some minutes to visit the map of the Monterrey metropolitan area. Do you have any comments to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jonathan, for your comments. And yeah, of course, also here, Peter put on the chat that it should be like also really interesting to look into this work with a stock and flow diagram. So you can see how this